Hey guys, tonight we're stripping away the Hollywood shine and diving into why being a medieval knight was actually a terrible life choice. We're talking about the dysentery, the debt, and the very real possibility of drowning, because your armor turned you into a human anchor. Before we get into the grim details, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy having your childhood fantasies systematically destroyed by historical reality. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious who's choosing to learn about medieval suffering at 3 in the morning. Now, get comfortable. Maybe grab a drink and prepare to never look at a knight in shining armor the same way again. Because tonight, we're talking about the heat exhaustion, the financial ruin, the infected blisters that could kill you, and why that suit of plate armor was less heroic warrior and more expensive metal coffin. Let's begin. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where chivalry was less about rescuing damsels and more about surviving dysentery while wearing 60 pounds of metal in the summer heat. You've seen the movies. You've played the video games. You think being a knight was all jesting tournaments, castle feasts, and looking heroic while your hair billows in the wind. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. It was mostly about being cold, wet, broke, and trying not to die from an infected blister. Let's start with the armor, because nothing says, "I've never actually worn armor," like thinking it made you look cool. Sure, a full suit of plate armor looks magnificent in a museum or on a movie poster. In reality, it was a metal prison that turned you into a walking oven. Imagine strapping on between 50 and 70 pounds of steel, depending on how wealthy or paranoid you were, then trying to do literally anything athletic. Go ahead, I'll wait. Can't scratch your nose. Can't bend down to tie your boot. Can't even use the bathroom without a support team and a prayer. And that's before we get to temperature regulation, which is a fancy way of saying, enjoy cooking in your own sweat. Summer campaigns were particularly delightful. You'd be marching through the French countryside, or the deserts of the Holy Land, and your armor would heat up like a frying pan. Knights regularly passed out from heat exhaustion, and more than a few drowned in rivers, because they were too heavy to swim when they fell in. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 saw French knights literally suffocating in their helmets, because they were packed so tightly together in the mud. They didn't die gloriously in combat. They died because they couldn't breathe and couldn't move, face down in the October sludge, while English archers picked them off like targets at a carnival. Then there's winter, which was somehow worse. Metal conducts cold extremely well, which means your armor became a full body ice pack. Knights would stuff their armor with cloth padding called an arming doublet. But that only did so much when you're standing guard duty at 3 in the morning in January. Frostbite was common, so was hypothermia. And if you were unlucky enough to fall into water during winter, congratulations, you're now an anchor. Multiple knights drowned this way, their armor dragging them down while they thrashed uselessly, their supposed protection becoming their coffin. But let's back up. Before you even got to wear armor, you had to become a knight, and that process was about as pleasant as medieval dentistry. If you were born to a noble family, your parents would ship you off at age 7 or 8 to become a page in another noble's household. 7 years old, that's second grade. Instead of learning multiplication tables, you'd be learning how to serve wine without spilling it, and how to address 17 different ranks of nobility without causing a blood feud. You'd spend your days running errands, holding your lord's cloak, and basically being a medieval intern with no pay and even worse hours. At 14, if you hadn't died from any of the dozens of diseases that killed medieval children at an alarming rate, you'd become a squire. This is where the real fun began. As a squire, your job was to be your knight's personal assistant, weapons tech, and occasionally human shield. You'd maintain his armor, which meant scrubbing off rust, blood, and worse, with sand and vinegar. You'd care for his horses, plural, because a proper knight needed at least 3: a war horse for battle, a riding horse for travel, and a pack horse for equipment. Horses, if you're not familiar with them, are large, expensive, and produce staggering amounts of manure. You'd be intimately familiar with all 3 aspects. You'd also train constantly. Sword fighting, lance work, horseback riding, wrestling, and something called quintain practice, where you'd charge at a spinning dummy with a lance, hit it wrong, and the dummy would spin around and smack you off your horse, to the great amusement of everyone watching. Medieval training didn't have safety regulations. You'd fight with real weapons, sometimes without padding, and injuries were considered character building. Broken bones were routine. Concussions were so common nobody even tracked them. If you survived to age 21 without losing any fingers or developing permanent brain damage, you might finally be knighted in a ceremony that cost your family approximately the modern equivalent of a luxury car. And congratulations, you're now broke. Because being a knight wasn't a job, it was an extremely expensive hobby that occasionally involved murder. You had to provide your own equipment, and we're not talking about a sword and a helmet. A full knightly kit included multiple sets of armor for different occasions, because you couldn't wear your fancy tournament armor to war. It wasn't practical. And you couldn't wear your war armor to tournaments, because it wasn't pretty enough. You needed multiple swords, lances, daggers, and a mace or war hammer for fighting other armored opponents. You needed those horses we mentioned, plus saddles, bridles, and horse armor, because your war horse was just as much a target as you were. You needed pavilion tents for campaigns, banners displaying your coat of arms, servants to manage everything, and enough money to feed and pay this entire traveling circus. The costs were astronomical. A good war horse could cost the equivalent of a small farm. A suit of quality plate armor cost as much as a modern luxury vehicle. Most knights were constantly in debt, borrowing money to maintain their status, while their estates barely generated enough income to cover the interest. This is why knights were always suing each other over property boundaries and inheritance rights. They weren't greedy, they were financially desperate. That inheritance dispute that started the duel between Jane de Carriages and Jacques Le Gris. Not romantic medieval drama. That was 2 men fighting to the death, because they literally couldn't afford not to. Now let's talk about actual combat, because this is where Hollywood really lies to you. Medieval warfare wasn't elegant. It wasn't honorable single combat where knights bowed before crossing swords. It was chaos, terror, and pragmatic brutality. When 2 armies met, the noise alone was overwhelming. Imagine thousands of men screaming war cries, metal clashing against metal, horses shrieking, drums pounding, and horns blaring. You couldn't hear orders. You could barely hear yourself think. Your vision was reduced to a narrow slit in your helmet. Assuming you had a helmet with a visor, your peripheral vision was gone. Someone could be attacking you from the side, and you wouldn't see them until their weapon hit you. And fighting in armor was exhausting. Modern tests have shown that even fit, trained individuals tire rapidly when fighting in full plate armor. Medieval battles could last hours. Knights would be swinging heavy weapons repeatedly while carrying 70 pounds of metal, and they'd be doing this in formation, packed shoulder to shoulder with other men. The fighting was less like a choreographed duel and more like an extremely violent shoving match where everyone had knives. You'd be pushing, hacking, stabbing at any gap in armor you could find. Armpits, groins, the backs of knees, eye slits. Medieval combat was aimed at the vulnerable spot, and it was viciously practical. Lances, those romantic symbols of knightly combat, were single-use weapons. You'd charge with your lance, hopefully hit something, and then your lance would shatter. That's it. Now you're in close quarters with a sword or mace, trying to bash or cut your opponent while they do the same to you. And here's something they don't show in movies. You couldn't kill an armored opponent easily with a sword. Plate armor was incredibly effective. Swords would bounce off it. This is why knights carried war hammers and maces. They could deliver blunt force trauma through armor, causing concussions, broken bones, and internal injuries even if they didn't penetrate the metal. If you knocked a knight down, which was the primary goal, they were in serious trouble. It's very difficult to stand up in full armor, especially on uneven ground or mud. Downed knights would be swarmed by enemy infantry, who'd flip them over and stab through the joints in their armor with daggers in a technique called half-swording. Or they'd just bash the fallen knight's head with rocks or hammers until he stopped moving. This is how most armored knights died in battle on their backs, unable to rise, being efficiently murdered by common soldiers who didn't care about chivalry or ransom and just wanted the expensive armor to sell. Speaking of ransom, this was actually the goal of most knightly combat. Killing enemy knights was wasteful when you could capture them and ransom them for enormous sums. This sounds civilized until you realize it meant that warfare became an economic transaction, backed by the constant threat of violence. Poor knights who couldn't pay ransoms might be held prisoner for years. Some died in captivity, forgotten. Others bankrupted their families to buy their freedom, and the process of capturing someone in battle was itself brutal. You'd beat them senseless, strip them of weapons, and drag them off the battlefield while fighting continued around you. Then you'd hold them in whatever passed for a prison, which ranged from actual dungeons to slightly nicer rooms, depending on their rank and your amenable nature. But wait, there's more. Because when you weren't fighting pitched battles, you were conducting sieges, and sieges were absolutely miserable for everyone involved. Medieval siege warfare could last months or even years. If you were besieging a castle, you'd set up camp outside and wait for the defenders to starve, which means you were living in a tent city with thousands of other soldiers, with all the sanitation issues that implies. Medieval armies didn't have sewage systems, they had latrine pits. Disease spread rapidly through siege camps. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera, and other delightful gastrointestinal ailments killed more medieval soldiers than combat ever did. You'd be constantly sick, eating terrible preserved food, and watching your comrades die from preventable illnesses, while you waited for the people inside the castle to die faster than you were dying outside it. And if you were inside the castle being besieged, not much better. Sure, you had walls, but you also had limited supplies, and you were trapped with hundreds of other people in an enclosed space. Sanitation degraded quickly. Water sources could be contaminated. Food supplies dwindled, and the besieging army would bombard you with siege engines, catapulting rocks, dead animals, and occasionally diseased corpses over your walls in an early form of biological warfare. Living under constant bombardment, not knowing when a stone might crash through your roof, was psychologically devastating. Knights during sieges developed what we'd now recognize as PTSD, but medieval medicine just called it cowardice and prescribed prayer. Then there's the chevauchée, a French term for a specific type of military campaign that was essentially organized terrorism. Knights would ride through enemy territory burning crops, destroying villages, killing livestock, and generally making life miserable for the civilian population. The goal wasn't to hold territory or fight battles. It was to economically devastate your enemy by destroying their agricultural base and tax revenue. Participating in a chevauchée meant spending weeks burning down peasant homes, which is less glorious knight and more war criminal. And before you think knights felt bad about this, remember that medieval social hierarchy considered peasants barely human. A knight burning a village felt roughly the same moral weight as you might feel mowing your lawn. The church tried to regulate this behavior with things like the peace of God and truce of God movements, which forbade fighting on certain days or harming certain people. Knights largely ignored these rules because, and I cannot stress this enough, medieval knights were violent thugs with military training and social status. They were the motorcycle gang members of their era, except they had legal authority and the blessing of the aristocracy. The image of the chivalrous knight is largely propaganda created by medieval romance literature, which was the fantasy fiction of its day. Real knights were more interested in plunder than poetry. And let's talk about tournaments, since those are supposed to be the glamorous part of knighthood. Early medieval tournaments were basically riot-adjacent war games. They weren't elegant justs with safety measures. They were mock battles called melees, where teams of knights would fight across several miles of countryside. And mock is doing heavy lifting here, because people regularly died. Knights would be captured and held for ransom just like in real warfare. Horses were killed. Spectators were sometimes trampled. The chaos was so extreme that multiple popes tried to ban tournaments, with limited success, because knights enjoyed beating each other up too much to stop. By the later Middle Ages, tournaments became more regulated and focused on justing, which was one-on-one combat on horseback with lances. This seems more controlled, and it was, but it was still phenomenally dangerous. Even with blunted lances and specialized armor, knights regularly suffered serious injuries. Lances would shatter and send splinters through helmet visors, blinding knights or penetrating their skulls. Knights would be thrown from horses and land badly, breaking their backs or necks. Some died days later from internal injuries that weren't initially apparent. King Henry II of France died from a jousting accident in 1559 when a lance splinter penetrated his helmet and entered his brain through his eye. He suffered for 11 days before dying. This wasn't a freak accident, it was an occupational hazard. And yet knights continued jousting because their entire social identity was wrapped up in being warriors. A knight who refused to joust was considered a coward, and reputation was everything in medieval society. Better to risk death or crippling injury than lose face in front of your peers. The training for jousting was itself dangerous. You'd practice by charging at a quintain, which we mentioned earlier, or at rings you'd try to catch on your lance tip while galloping. Miss, and you look foolish. Hit it wrong, and you might fall off your horse at high speed. Knights trained constantly, because jousting required perfect timing, balance, and horse control, and even then, accidents were common. Chronicles are full of knights who died in practice, or in minor tournaments, that nobody remembers except as cautionary tales about the dangers of the profession. And the horses deserve their own discussion, because nobody talks about how absolutely critical and vulnerable they were. A knight's warhorse was his most valuable possession, more expensive than his armor, and also a living creature that could panic, get sick, or die at inconvenient moments. Warhorses were trained to bite and kick in battle, essentially making them large, armored attack dogs. But they were still horses. They could throw a shoe and go lame. They could catch diseases. They could be wounded in battle, and a horse injury ended your career as a mounted knight faster than anything else. If your warhorse was killed in battle, you were now a foot soldier, which was a dramatic downgrade in status and combat effectiveness. Knights on foot were slower, less mobile, and couldn't deliver the shock impact of a cavalry charge. You'd be relegated to fighting alongside infantry, which you'd probably consider humiliating because medieval class consciousness was intense. And replacing a dead warhorse was financially devastating. Remember, these animals cost as much as a small farm. Lose your warhorse, and you might be out of the knight game entirely unless you could borrow, beg, or steal another one. Caring for horses was also a full-time job. They needed to be fed, watered, groomed, exercised, and monitored for health problems. Horses get sick easily. They can colic and die within hours. They can develop hoof problems that require skilled farriers to fix. A lame horse was useless, and medieval veterinary medicine was, charitably, primitive. Your horses were also targets. In battle, enemy infantry would specifically target knights' horses, because an unhorsed knight was much easier to kill or capture. Archers aimed for horses. Infantry with polearms would try to hamstring them. Your expensive, crucial warhorse had a life expectancy measured in battles, and every engagement risked losing your most important asset. Now let's discuss the glamorous topic of medieval hygiene, or the lack thereof. You've probably heard that medieval people never bathed, which isn't entirely true. Public bathhouses existed, and people did wash. But knights on campaign had limited hygiene options. You'd be wearing your armor for days or weeks at a time. Underneath the armor, you wore layers of padding and cloth that would become soaked with sweat. This padding couldn't be easily washed on campaign, so it would start to smell aggressively. The smell of a medieval army was reportedly detectable from miles away. Thousands of unwashed men, horses, human waste, rotting food, and the sweet, sick smell of infected wounds all combined into an olfactory nightmare. Your skin underneath all that padding would develop rashes, blisters, and sores from constant friction and moisture. These could become infected, and infected wounds in the Middle Ages were a death sentence waiting to happen. Medieval medicine had no concept of germ theory. They didn't understand infection. A small cut could become gangrenous, spreading up your limb, turning black and necrotic, until you either died from sepsis or had the limb amputated with a sore and no anesthesia beyond alcohol and prayer. Knights died from minor wounds that became infected more often than they died from immediately fatal injuries. Speaking of injuries, let's talk about what happened when you actually got hurt in battle. If you were lucky, you'd take a blow that your armor absorbed, leaving you with just a massive bruise and maybe some broken ribs. If you were unlucky, you'd take a weapon through a gap in your armor, and now you're bleeding, possibly heavily. Medieval battlefield medicine was practically non-existent. There were no medics. There were no ambulances. If you went down wounded, you'd better hope your side won the battle, and your friends could drag you off the field before you bled out or got trampled. If you survived long enough to get treatment, medieval surgery was a horror show. Surgeons were considered low-status craftsmen, barely above butchers, and their methods reflected this. They'd probe wounds with unwashed hands or instruments, introducing infection. They'd cauterize wounds with hot iron to stop bleeding, which involved pressing burning metal into your flesh. They'd use silk thread for sutures, which sounds nice until you learn they didn't sterilize it. Infection was almost guaranteed. For more serious injuries, amputation was the answer. Broken limb with bones sticking out, amputation. Deep wound that won't stop bleeding, amputation. Wound that looks infected, believe it or not, also amputation. The procedure involved tying off the limb to restrict blood flow, sawing through the bone with a surgical saw while you screamed and thrashed, and then cauterizing the stump with hot iron or boiling oil. The mortality rate was absurdly high. Most people died from shock during the procedure or infection afterward. Those who survived were permanently disabled in an era with no social safety net, no disability benefits, and a culture that valued physical prowess above all. And then there were the diseases. Oh, the diseases. Bubonic plague, obviously, which killed a third of Europe's population in the 14th century. But also smallpox, tuberculosis, leprosy, dysentery, typhoid, cholera, influenza, and dozens of other ailments that modern medicine has largely eliminated or made treatable. Knights weren't immune to disease just because they were aristocrats. They died from plague, from camp fever during sieges, from the bloody flux on campaign, and when they got sick, medieval medicine offered treatments ranging from ineffective to actively harmful. Bloodletting was a popular treatment for almost everything, based on the theory of humoral imbalance that had no basis in reality. Feeling feverish? Let's drain some of your blood, which will definitely help your body fight off whatever infection you're dealing with. Suffering from an infected wound, more bloodletting, plague symptoms, bloodletting plus some herbs and prayers. Medieval physicians meant well, but their treatments often hastened death rather than preventing it. Knights who survived battles often didn't survive the medical treatment for their wounds. Let's also discuss the psychological toll of medieval warfare, which nobody talks about because medieval culture didn't really have a framework for mental health. We now know that combat causes PTSD, anxiety, depression, and other psychological conditions. Medieval knights experienced all of this, but had no language for it and no treatment. A knight who showed signs of what we'd call PTSD might be called melancholic or cowardly. There was no therapy, no support groups, no recognition that witnessing horrific violence and participating in killing might affect your mental state. Knights dealt with this through drinking, which was common, or through religious devotion, or by simply not dealing with it at all. Medieval literature is full of knights having religious crises or retreating to monasteries after years of warfare, and in retrospect, these look a lot like mental health breakdowns. But the cultural expectation was that knights should be brave, stoic, and ready to fight at any moment. Showing vulnerability was weakness. So knights bottled up their trauma, and either developed unhealthy coping mechanisms, or had breakdowns that their contemporaries didn't understand. The violence they witnessed and participated in was extreme. Battles involved watching friends die horribly, often in front of you, while you were powerless to help because you were fighting for your own life. Sieges involved seeing starvation and disease ravage populations. Chivotches involved burning homes while people screamed inside them. Even tournaments involved serious injuries and death. Knights were exposed to traumatic events repeatedly throughout their careers, and the expectation was that they'd simply carry on as if this were normal, because in their culture it was. And let's not forget the political complexities of being a knight. You weren't an independent agent. You were part of a feudal system with complicated obligations. You owed military service to your lord, typically 40 days per year. Though this varied, your lord could call on you to fight his battles, whether you agreed with them or not. Refusing was treason, which carried penalties ranging from losing your lands to execution. So you'd find yourself fighting in wars you didn't necessarily support, against enemies you had no personal quarrel with, because your feudal contract required it. This system also meant you were caught in the middle of aristocratic feuds and power struggles. If your lord rebelled against his lord, you were expected to join the rebellion, even if it put you on the wrong side of the king. If your lord switched allegiances, you switched with him. Your personal honor and opinions were secondary to your feudal obligations. And heaven help you if you were caught between competing loyalties, which happened frequently. Do you support your lord or the king, your father's family or your wife's family? These weren't academic questions. They were life and death decisions that could result in your lands being confiscated, your family being disinherited, or you being executed for treason. The legal system was also stacked against you in interesting ways. As a knight, you were subject to different laws than commoners, which sounds like a privilege until you realize it meant you were held to higher standards. A knight who committed a crime faced harsher punishments because you were supposed to be better than common people. You could be stripped of your knighthood, which was a social death sentence, leaving you without status, income, or purpose. And the legal process itself was a nightmare of feudal courts, ecclesiastical courts, and royal courts, all with overlapping jurisdictions and competing interests. This brings us to trial by combat, which we touched on earlier, but deserves a deeper look. When judicial combat was an option. It sounds dramatic and exciting, until you realize it meant your life or property could be decided by your ability to stab someone better than they stabbed you. Were you actually guilty? Didn't matter. What mattered was whether you or your champion could win a fight. This system heavily favored wealthy, skilled fighters, which was the point. Medieval justice was designed to benefit the aristocracy. But it also meant that truth was less important than violence, and knights lived under a system where any legal dispute could end in sanctioned murder. Jean de Carrages and Jacques Legris's duel in 1386 wasn't just about one accusation. It was the culmination of years of legal battles, property disputes, and personal animosity in a system that ultimately said, We can't figure this out, so kill each other, and we'll call it divine judgment. And Marguerite de Carriages, the actual victim, had to watch her fate be decided by combat while sitting on a scaffold ready to be executed if her husband lost. That's not justice. That sanctioned brutality with religious justification. And this was normal. Knights participated in and accepted this system because it maintained their power and status. Now let's talk about the Crusades, because those are often romanticized as holy wars when they were actually expensive, brutal expeditions with horrifying mortality rates. If you took the cross and joined a crusade, congratulations. You just volunteered for years of hardship, with a high probability of death. The journey to the Holy Land took months, whether you went by land through Eastern Europe or by sea through the Mediterranean. The land route exposed you to attacks from hostile forces, disease, starvation when supplies ran low, and the elements. The sea route risked storms, shipwrecks and pirates. Once you arrived, assuming you survived the journey, you'd be fighting in an unfamiliar climate against enemies who knew the terrain. European knights in the Levant struggled with heat, disease, and supply lines stretched across thousands of miles. The Crusader states were constantly undermanned and under-resourced, surrounded by Muslim territories that wanted them gone. Knights died from disease, from combat, from infected wounds, from heat stroke, from dysentery, and from simple exhaustion. The First Crusade, which successfully captured Jerusalem, saw mortality rates estimated at 75–80% of the original crusading force. 3/4 of the people who started the journey died before it ended, and the violence was extreme even by medieval standards. The sack of Jerusalem in 1099 involved crusaders massacring the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, killing tens of thousands of people in an orgy of violence that shocked even medieval chroniclers. Knights participated in this. They weren't just fighting enemy soldiers, they were killing civilians, including women and children, in the name of religion. Later crusades saw similar atrocities on all sides. The Fourth Crusade infamously sacked Constantinople, a Christian city, in 1204 because Venetian merchants redirected the crusade for profit. Knights who went on crusade often did so for complex reasons. Genuine religious devotion, yes, but also seeking adventure, hoping to win land and wealth, escaping debts at home, or fulfilling penance for crimes. The younger sons of noble families, who wouldn't inherit their father's lands, saw crusading as an opportunity to carve out their own territories. For them, the Crusades were violent real estate speculation wrapped in religious justification. And many knights mortgaged or sold their lands to finance the journey, bankrupting themselves in the process. If they died, which was likely, their families were left destitute. Those who survived and returned home found readjustment difficult. They'd been gone for years, had witnessed and participated in unimaginable violence, and came back to find their lands mismanaged, their debts grown, and their world moved on without them. Some never fully readjusted. The Crusades left a legacy of trauma, economic hardship, and religious fanaticism that poisoned European society for generations. Let's also discuss what knights did when they weren't fighting, because the answer is mostly try to manage their estates and inevitably fail. Knights were landlords, but most were spectacularly bad at estate management. They'd been trained from childhood to fight, not to farm or manage accounts. Their education focused on weapons, horses, and aristocratic etiquette, not on crop rotation or tax collection. So they delegate to bailiffs and stewards, who often embezzled or mismanaged funds, because medieval accounting was primitive and oversight was difficult. A knight's income came from their lands, which meant collecting rents and taxes from peasants, who were themselves barely surviving. Medieval agriculture was subsistence level for most people. Peasants produced just enough to feed themselves and pay their obligations, with little surplus. A bad harvest, which happened frequently due to poor weather, crop disease, or war damage, meant peasants couldn't pay their rents, which meant the knight couldn't pay his debts or maintain his equipment. The whole feudal economy was one bad harvest away from collapse at any given moment. Knights tried to supplement their income through various means. Tournament winnings were one option, though risky. You could lose your horse and armor if you lost badly. Ransom from captured enemies was another, but required winning battles first. Some knights resorted to what was politely called adventuring, and more accurately called banditry, where they'd rob travelers, rustle livestock, or raid their neighbors' lands. Medieval roads were dangerous partly because unemployed or impoverished knights turned to robbery to survive. The daily life of a knight, when not at war or tournament, was surprisingly boring. You'd wake up, attend morning mass, because you were expected to be pious, then deal with estate business, hearing disputes between peasants, checking on farm work, meeting with your bailiff about accounts you didn't fully understand. You'd train in the afternoon, because staying combat ready required constant practice, but you'd done the same training routines for years, and they were monotonous. You'd feast in the evening if you could afford it, which often you couldn't, so you'd eat bread, pottage, and maybe some meat if you were lucky. Entertainment options were limited. You could hunt, which was both recreation and a way to supplement your food supply. You could listen to traveling minstrels if any passed through, which was rare in rural areas. You could drink, which was very common and led to alcoholism being a serious problem among medieval knights. Mostly, you'd be bored, stuck in a drafty castle or manor house, dealing with the same petty problems day after day, waiting for the next war or tournament to give your life meaning. The castle you lived in, if you were wealthy enough to have one, wasn't the romantic fairy tale setting of fiction. Medieval castles were cold, drafty, dark, and damp. Windows were small and often covered with cloth or shutters rather than glass, which was expensive and rare. Heat came from fireplaces that were inefficient and filled the rooms with smoke. The floors were stone or packed earth, covered with rushes that got dirty and were periodically replaced. Furniture was minimal and uncomfortable by modern standards. Privacy was non-existent. Most castle rooms were communal spaces where you'd sleep, eat, and work alongside your household. Sanitation in castles was primitive. Toilets were basically chutes that dropped waste into the moat or a cesspit. These were called garderobes, and they were cold, smelly, and offered no privacy. Bathing was infrequent, requiring servants to haul and heat water, so you'd bathe maybe once a month if that. The smell inside a medieval castle was pungent, unwashed bodies, smoke from fires, food cooking, animal smells from the stables and kennels, human waste from the garderobes, and general mustiness from the damp stone. The food was heavily salted or pickled to preserve it, making it extremely salty by modern standards, and not particularly healthy. Fresh food was seasonal. You ate what was currently growing, or what had been preserved from the harvest. Meat was available if you were wealthy, but it was often tough and gamey. Bread was a staple, but medieval bread was coarse, and could contain bits of grit from the millstones. Nobles drank wine or ale, because water was often unsafe, which meant everyone was mildly drunk most of the time, including children who drank weak ale. Disease was omnipresent. Castles and manor houses were full of vermin, rats, mice, fleas, lice. These carried diseases, but nobody understood disease transmission, so they just accepted that vermin were part of life. Fleas spread plague. Lice caused typhus. Contaminated water caused dysentery. Food poisoning was common because food preservation methods were imperfect. A knight could survive a dozen battles and then die from eating spoiled meat or drinking bad water. And let's talk about family life, because being a knight meant your family relationships were mostly political arrangements. Marriages were made for alliances and property consolidation, not love. You'd likely marry someone you barely knew, chosen by your family to strengthen political ties or merge estates. Your wife was expected to manage the household, bear children, and stay out of politics, though some medieval women wielded considerable power despite these restrictions. Child mortality was horrifically high. A knight and his wife might have 8 or 10 children, and half wouldn't survive to adulthood. Disease, accidents, and the general hazards of medieval life killed children at staggering rates. You'd watch your children die from illnesses that are now easily treatable: measles, whooping cough, scarlet fever, diphtheria. Medieval parents learned not to get too attached to young children because the odds of survival were so poor. This emotional distance was a psychological defense mechanism against constant grief. If your children survived, the sons would be sent away at age 7 to become pages, just as you were, continuing the cycle of training that created knights. Daughters would be married off as teenagers to whichever alliance was politically useful. You'd have minimal involvement in raising your children. That was delegated to nurses, tutors, and other households. The nuclear family as we understand it didn't really exist. Children were economic assets and political tools, and affection was secondary to practical concerns. Your wife, meanwhile, had her own set of hardships. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was extremely dangerous. Women died in labor regularly from hemorrhage, infection, or obstructed births that couldn't be surgically resolved. Every pregnancy was life-threatening. If your wife died, which was likely after several pregnancies, you'd remarry quickly because you needed someone to manage the household and produce heirs. There was little time for grief in medieval life. Pragmatism trumped emotion. Now let's discuss the twilight of knighthood, because the military relevance of knights declined pretty dramatically, and watching it happen must have been psychologically devastating for men whose entire identity was wrapped up in being warriors. The introduction of the longbow, first used effectively by the English, changed warfare fundamentally. English archers at Crecy in 1346 and Agincourt in 1415 demonstrated that mounted knights could be defeated by common soldiers with bows. Arrows couldn't penetrate plate armor easily, but they didn't need to. They killed horses, they found gaps in armor, and they disrupted cavalry charges before they could build momentum. Then came crossbows, which were even more effective. Crossbows could be used by anyone with minimal training, unlike longbows that required years of practice, and they could punch through armor at close range. The church tried to ban crossbows as unchristian weapons, which tells you how terrified the aristocracy was of a weapon that democratized violence. But bans didn't work because crossbows were too effective. And then came gunpowder. Early firearms were unreliable, inaccurate, and slow to reload, but they could penetrate armor, and they got better rapidly. By the late 15th century, guns were rendering armor obsolete. Knights responded by making armor thicker and heavier, which just made them slower and less mobile without actually making them safe. The era of the armored cavalry charge was ending, and knights knew it but couldn't accept it. The psychological impact of becoming militarily obsolete must have been crushing. Knights had spent their entire lives training for combat, invested enormous wealth in equipment, and built their entire identity around being elite warriors. And now peasants with guns or bows could kill them from a distance without even engaging in honorable combat. The chivalric code emphasized personal valor and face-to-face combat, but the reality of warfare was moving toward ranged weapons, artillery, and professional infantry formations. Knights became ceremonial figures. Their role reduced to pageantry, while actual military power shifted to professional armies. This transition was gradual and uneven, which made it worse. Knights kept insisting they were still relevant, kept wearing increasingly elaborate armor to tournaments, even as it became useless on battlefields, kept clinging to outdated military tactics, because admitting obsolescence meant admitting their entire way of life was ending. The Battle of Pavia in 1525 saw the last major cavalry charge of armored knights, and it was a disaster. French knights charged Spanish arquebusiers and were shot to pieces. The age of the knight ended not with a glorious last stand, but with confused aristocrats dying ingloriously to firearms wielded by commoners they considered beneath them. But let's return to the prime of knighthood, because we haven't fully covered just how miserable military campaigns were. Imagine you've been called to war by your lord. You gather your equipment, which takes days because you need to pack armor, weapons, tents, food supplies, and organize your retinue of servants and soldiers who accompany you. You say goodbye to your family, knowing you might not return, and set off on what will likely be months away from home. The march to war was itself an ordeal. Armies moved slowly, maybe 10 to 15 miles per day, if they were lucky. Roads were terrible, often just dirt tracks that became mud pits in rain. You'd be riding or walking for hours every day, week after week. The supply train would stretch for miles, wagons carrying food, equipment, siege engines, all moving at the pace of the slowest ox. And you couldn't just live off the land, because thousands of soldiers would strip an area of food within days, leaving nothing behind. Foraging, which sounds adventurous, was actually systematic robbery. Soldiers would fan out from the army to take food, livestock, and anything else useful from the local population. This often involved violence because peasants didn't want to surrender their only means of survival. Foraging parties would raid villages, take what they needed by force, and sometimes kill anyone who resisted. This wasn't aberrant behavior. It was standard military practice. Armies fed themselves by taking food from civilians, and if people starved afterward, that was their problem. The weather made everything worse. March in the rain and you'd be soaked for days, your clothes never fully drying, your armor rusting despite your best efforts. March in summer heat and you'd be parched, water supplies running low, heat exhaustion claiming soldiers daily. March in winter and you'd be freezing, frostbite taking fingers and toes, men dying from exposure in the night. Medieval armies had no meteorology, no weather forecasts. You marched regardless of conditions and dealt with whatever nature threw at you. And then there was the waiting. Medieval warfare involved a lot of waiting. Waiting for other contingents to arrive. Waiting for supplies. Waiting for orders. Waiting for the enemy to make a move. Waiting during sieges for the defenders to surrender or starve. Boredom was a constant companion, occasionally punctuated by brief periods of terror when actual fighting broke out. Soldiers dealt with boredom through gambling, drinking, fighting amongst themselves, and generally causing problems that commanders struggled to control. Discipline in medieval armies was inconsistent at best. Knights considered themselves equals to their commanders, all being part of the aristocracy, and they didn't take orders well. They'd argue about tactics, refuse commands they considered beneath their dignity, and sometimes just do whatever they wanted regardless of the battle plan. This lack of discipline contributed to numerous military disasters where knights charged prematurely, broke formation, or pursued enemies when they should have held position. The common soldiers in the army, infantry and archers, were often pressed into service and didn't want to be there. Desertion was rampant. Men would slip away in the night, heading home despite the penalties for desertion, because they'd rather risk punishment than die in a war they didn't care about. This meant armies constantly bled manpower, even without fighting, and commanders had to threaten execution to keep their forces together. When battle finally came, and it could come suddenly with little warning, the experience was overwhelming. You'd form up with your unit, surrounded by other knights and soldiers, and wait for the order to advance. The fear was physical, a tightness in your chest, a sick feeling in your stomach. You'd pray, check your equipment for the 100th time, and try not to think about what was about to happen. Then the horns would sound, and you'd move forward. The charge of heavy cavalry, which is portrayed as glorious in fiction, was actually terrifying for everyone involved, including the knights doing the charging. You'd urge your horse to a gallop, holding your lance, watching the enemy line get closer at frightening speed. Your vision would narrow to tunnel vision from the adrenaline and fear. You couldn't really control your horse in formation. You were just trying to stay in the saddle and point your lance at something, and then impact. The collision between cavalry and infantry, or between two cavalry forces, was violent beyond description. Horses slammed into each other and into men at full speed. Lances shattered, throwing splinters everywhere. Men were thrown from horses, trampled, impaled. The noise was deafening. And then, assuming you survived the initial impact, you were in the melee, fighting for your life with whatever weapons you had left. The battle would fragment into dozens of individual fights, happening simultaneously. You'd lose all sense of the larger picture, focused only on the immediate threat in front of you. Someone trying to kill you. Someone you were trying to kill. Hack/block, trying to stay alive. Minutes would feel like hours. Your arms would burn from swinging heavy weapons. You'd be panting for breath inside your helmet, the air hot and thick. And you'd keep fighting because stopping meant dying. If your side started to lose, the retreat was often more deadly than the battle itself. A controlled retreat was nearly impossible to maintain. It would turn into a rout, with soldiers fleeing in panic, while the enemy pursued and cut them down from behind. Knights trying to retreat in armor were easy targets. Many were pulled from their horses and killed. Others died because they couldn't run fast enough. The pursuit after a lost battle claimed more lives than the battle itself. If your side won, you'd face the aftermath, which was grim. The battlefield would be covered with dead and wounded men and horses. The wounded would be screaming for help, crying for water, begging to die. Many wounded would be killed by soldiers moving through the battlefield, either as mercy killings or because they had valuables worth taking. Bodies would be stripped of armor, weapons, and anything else valuable. The dead would be left where they fell, unless they were important enough to warrant burial, which most weren't. The smell was indescribable. Blood, opened bowels, death. It would permeate everything. You'd try to eat that evening, and the smell would still be in your nose, making you nauseous. You'd try to sleep, and you'd hear the moans of dying men who hadn't been found or helped. And you'd know that in the next battle, that could be you, dying slowly on the ground, while people stepped over your body looking for coins in your pockets. Medieval soldiers dealt with post-battle trauma by drinking heavily, which was the only coping mechanism available. There was no debriefing, no counseling, no recognition that what they'd experienced was traumatic. They were just expected to carry on, to be ready to fight again tomorrow or next week. The psychological damage accumulated over campaigns and careers, manifesting as rage, depression, emotional numbness, or sudden violence over trivial matters. And let's be clear about the violence of medieval warfare. This wasn't sanitized Hollywood combat. Men were hacked apart with swords and axes. They were crushed by maces. They were perforated by arrows and bolts. Wounds were horrific. Limbs hanging by strips of flesh, faces split open, intestines spilling from abdominal wounds. Medieval weapons were designed to cause maximum damage, and they succeeded. A warhammer blow could cave in a helmet and skull together. A sword strike could sever a limb. An arrow could pin a man's arm to his body. The wounded who survived long enough to receive treatment faced agonizing procedures without anesthesia. Arrow extraction was particularly brutal. Arrows that penetrated armor often had barbed heads that couldn't be pulled straight out. Surgeons would either push them through, creating a second wound, or cut them out, enlarging the wound significantly. The pain was excruciating. Men would scream until they passed out or had to be held down by multiple people. And after all that, infection was likely, which meant days or weeks of fever and pain before either recovery or death. Knights witnessed this repeatedly throughout their careers. They saw friends die badly. They saw enemies die badly. They inflicted terrible wounds on others and received wounds themselves. The cumulative psychological effect was profound, even though medieval culture didn't acknowledge it. Some knights seemed to become desensitized, treating violence as routine. Others developed what looks in hindsight like severe PTSD, becoming withdrawn, violent, paranoid, or religiously obsessed. There was no treatment, no support system, nothing but time and the expectation that you'd continue functioning. Now let's talk about the specific horrors of siege warfare, because sieges were where medieval warfare reached peak misery for everyone involved. If you were part of a besieging force, you'd set up camp outside the enemy fortification and prepare for a long stay. Siege camps were enormous, sprawling tent cities that housed thousands of soldiers, support personnel, camp followers, and all the infrastructure needed to maintain an army. And they were cesspits, literally and figuratively. Sanitation in a siege camp was almost non-existent. With thousands of people concentrated in a small area for months, waste became a massive problem. Latrine pits would be dug, but they'd quickly fill or overflow. Human waste would contaminate water sources. Disease would spread rapidly: typhoid from contaminated water, dysentery from poor hygiene, typhus from lice, plague from rats attracted to the garbage and corpses. More soldiers died from disease during sieges than from combat, often by significant margins. Food quality deteriorated as sieges dragged on. Fresh food would run out quickly, leaving preserved rations that were nutritionally poor and barely edible. Scurvy from vitamin C deficiency would set in. Soldiers would become weak, their teeth loosening, old wounds reopening. Malnutrition would make everyone more susceptible to disease. And if supply lines were cut or disrupted, which happened frequently, the besieging army would start to starve. Forced to either give up the siege or forage more aggressively, which meant traveling farther afield and risking ambush. The actual siege operations were dangerous and tedious. Soldiers would dig trenches and build siege engines, trebuchets, mangonels, battering rams, siege towers. This construction took weeks or months of hard labor, digging, cutting timber, hauling stones, and all of this was done within range of the castle's defenses. Defenders would shoot arrows and crossbow bolts at the workers. They'd drop rocks and boiling water on anyone who got too close to the walls. They'd sally out in surprise attacks to destroy siege engines and kill workers. Building siege equipment was more dangerous than actual combat. When the siege engines were ready, the bombardment would begin. Trebuchets would hurl stones, weighing hundreds of pounds, at the walls, trying to breach them. The noise was constant, day and night. Crashes as stones hit walls, the creaking of the trebuchets, shouting, the screams of anyone hit by flying debris. This would go on for days or weeks, battering the walls, trying to create a breach large enough to storm through. Mining was another siege tactic, and it was claustrophobic nightmare fuel. Besiegers would dig tunnels under the walls, shoring them up with timber, trying to reach the foundation. Defenders would dig counter mines, trying to intercept the attackers' tunnels. When tunnels met, there'd be underground combat in narrow, dark spaces, fighting with knives and clubs, because there wasn't room for larger weapons. Men died underground, buried alive when tunnels collapsed, suffocated by bad air, or killed in the darkness by enemies they couldn't see. When a breach was finally created, or the siege tower rolled up to the walls, the assault would begin. This was the most dangerous moment of the siege. Soldiers would charge through the breach or climb the siege tower, funneling into narrow passages, while defenders rained down arrows, stones, boiling oil, and anything else they could throw. The casualties were staggering. Attack waves would be repulsed repeatedly, leaving piles of dead at the breach. Eventually, through sheer numbers and determination, attackers might break through, and then the real horror began. The sack of a captured city or castle was organized chaos and violence. Medieval law held that if a city resisted and was taken by storm, it could be sacked, meaning the soldiers could loot and kill freely for a period. This was supposed to incentivize cities to surrender peacefully, but it also meant that every successful assault was followed by atrocities. Soldiers, having endured months of hardship and danger, would rampage through the captured location, killing anyone they found, looting everything of value, raping women, and burning what they couldn't carry. Knights participated in this, or at minimum, looked the other way while their men did it. The aftermath of a sack was apocalyptic. Buildings burned. Bodies filled the streets. Survivors, if any, were often enslaved or held for ransom. The entire economic and social structure of the place was destroyed. And this wasn't rare or exceptional. This was standard procedure for most of the Middle Ages. Cities that resisted faced sack. The threat was real, and the reality was as bad as the threat suggested. If you were inside a castle or city being besieged, your experience was different, but equally miserable. Initially, assuming you had good supplies, you'd be relatively secure behind your walls. But as the siege dragged on, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food would be rationed, then rationed more strictly, then essentially unavailable. People would eat horses, dogs, cats, rats, leather, eventually anything remotely edible. Starvation wasn't quick. It was a slow decline over weeks as the body consumed itself. People would become skeletal, too weak to move, their bodies shutting down from lack of nutrition. Water was critical. If the castle had a good well, you might be okay. If not, water supplies would run out or become contaminated, forcing people to drink fouled water and spreading disease even faster. Typhoid and dysentery would rage through the defenders. The sick would outnumber the healthy. Dead bodies would pile up faster than they could be buried, creating sanitation nightmares and spreading disease further. Morale would collapse as the siege continued. Defenders would know that relief was unlikely, and that if the castle fell, they'd likely be killed or enslaved. Desperation would set in. Some defenders would try to escape, though this was incredibly dangerous. Others would consider surrender, though that might mean execution for treason. The psychological pressure of being trapped, starving, sick, and under constant bombardment would break people. Some would go mad. Others would commit suicide. The rest would simply endure, hoping for a miracle that usually didn't come. When defenders finally surrendered or were overrun, their fate depended on circumstances. If the siege had been long and costly, attackers might execute everyone as punishment. If the defenders were noble and could pay ransom, they might be spared but imprisoned. Common soldiers and civilians had no such protection. They'd be killed or enslaved, their fate determined by whether the attackers felt merciful, which after months of siege, they usually didn't. Knights participated in sieges throughout their careers, both as attackers and defenders, and the experience was universally miserable. There was no glory in siege warfare, just grinding attrition, disease, boredom, and sudden violence. Yet sieges were the most common form of medieval warfare. Pitched battles were relatively rare because they were risky and decisive. Sieges were how wars were actually fought and won, which meant knights spent most of their military careers being cold, bored, sick, and scared rather than engaging in glorious single combat. And we need to talk about the economic reality of knighthood more explicitly, because the financial pressure was constant and crushing. Being a knight required significant income from land, but most knights were not wealthy. They were minor nobility with small estates that barely generated enough revenue to cover their expenses. The cost of maintaining horses, armor, weapons, and a retinue was enormous. Add in the cost of attending tournaments, fulfilling military obligations, and maintaining their social status, and most knights were constantly in debt. Medieval banking was primitive and predatory. Knights would borrow money at high interest rates from Jewish moneylenders, one of the few groups allowed to charge interest under church law, or from Italian banking families. These debts would accumulate, growing beyond any hope of repayment. Many knights owed more than their entire estate was worth. Creditors couldn't easily seize noble lands due to feudal law, but they could make life miserable, and knights lived under constant financial stress. This economic pressure drove much of the violence we associate with medieval knights. That inheritance dispute. It's because losing that land meant financial ruin. That tournament participation, despite injury risk. The prize money was necessary to pay debts. That participation in a crusade or war. The potential for plunder and ransom might clear some debts. Knights weren't just warrior aristocrats. They were often desperate men, trying to maintain an expensive lifestyle on insufficient income. Some knights dealt with this by marrying wealthy heiresses, which was a standard strategy. If you could marry a woman with significant lands or wealth, you could solve your financial problems. This led to a marriage market where wealthy women and heiresses were pursued aggressively by impoverished knights. The women had little say in these arrangements. Their value was economic, and they'd be married off to whoever offered the best alliance or paid the most, regardless of their preferences. Other knights turned to less legitimate income sources. Robbery, as mentioned, was common. Extortion was another tactic, where knights would threaten violence unless paid off. Some knights essentially ran protection rackets, demanding payment from merchants and travelers for safe passage through their lands. These activities blurred the line between knight and bandit, but economic necessity drove many to cross that line. The Church tried to channel this violence through institutions like the Crusades and religious military orders, but this just redirected the violence rather than eliminating it. Knights in the Crusades were still pursuing wealth and land, just with religious justification. The military orders, like the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, were warrior monks, but they were also banking institutions and landholders, engaged in the same economic struggles as secular knights. Let's also discuss the training injuries that knights accumulated over their careers, because the constant physical training took a serious toll. Medieval training was brutal and lacked safety measures. Knights would practice sword fighting with real weapons, or very lightly blunted training swords. Injuries were expected and common. Broken fingers, cut hands, bruised ribs, concussions from being hit in the head. These injuries would accumulate over years. Jousting practice was particularly dangerous, as we've mentioned, but even basic riding could cause injuries. Falls from horses were common. A bad fall could break bones, damage joints, or cause head injuries. Knights who trained for decades would develop chronic pain from old injuries that had healed poorly. Joint damage from wearing heavy armor and from weapon impacts would cause arthritis. Back problems from the constant stress of armor weight were universal. By their 40s, most knights were physically diminished compared to their youth. The accumulated injuries, the joint damage, the old wounds that never healed quite right. All of this meant that older knights couldn't fight as effectively as younger ones. Yet they were still expected to fulfill their military obligations, to attend tournaments, to maintain their warrior status. Some knights in their 50s or 60s were still campaigning, despite being in chronic pain and nowhere near their physical prime. Medieval medicine had little to offer for chronic pain or injury rehabilitation. There was no physical therapy, no painkillers beyond alcohol and opium derivatives that were rare and expensive. Knights simply lived with pain, treating it as normal and expected. The Stoic ideal of the period demanded that men not complain about pain or weakness. So knights suffered in silence, while their bodies broke down from years of abuse. The diet of knights also contributed to health problems. Medieval noble diet was heavy in meat, particularly game and salted pork, and light on fruits and vegetables, which were considered peasant food. This diet was high in protein and fat but deficient in vitamins and fiber. Knights regularly suffered from gout, a painful arthritis caused by high purine intake from excessive meat consumption. They also dealt with constipation, digestive problems, and vitamin deficiencies that medieval medicine couldn't diagnose or treat. Dental health was terrible across all social classes, but knights had specific problems. Medieval bread often contained grit from stone mills, which wore down tooth enamel. Sugar was becoming more available to the wealthy by the later Middle Ages, contributing to tooth decay. And there was no real dentistry beyond extraction. A bad tooth meant incredible pain until it was pulled, often by a barber or blacksmith using crude tools and no anesthesia. Knights would lose teeth throughout their lives, making eating difficult and sometimes leading to infections that could spread to the jaw and become life-threatening. The cumulative effect of all these health problems meant that knights aged poorly. A 40, 60-year-old knight might look and feel like a 60-year-old by modern standards. Life expectancy for those who survived childhood was actually reasonably decent, mid-50s to early 60s if you avoided disease and violence. But quality of life declined sharply after 40. Knights in their later years were often in poor health, in chronic pain, and no longer able to fulfill the physical demands of their role. This created a social problem because knightly identity was tied to martial prowess. A knight who could no longer fight effectively was, in some sense, not really a knight anymore. Older knights might retire to their estates and focus on management, or they might join religious orders, effectively retiring from secular life. But this transition was psychologically difficult for men whose entire identity and purpose had been built around being warriors. Some older knights became bitter and difficult, unable to accept their physical decline. Others adapted by focusing on mentoring younger knights or on administrative roles. But the transition from active warrior to retired elder was challenging in a culture that valued physical strength and combat ability above almost everything else. There was no roadmap for aging gracefully as a knight, and many struggled with it. Now let's address the elephant in the room: the violence that knights directed at women. Medieval society was deeply patriarchal, and women had few rights or protections. Knights, as armed men with social status and legal advantages, could and did commit violence against women with little consequence. Rape was depressingly common during military campaigns. When armies passed through territory, women would hide or flee because soldiers, including knights, would rape any women they found. This violence was so expected that it was barely remarked upon in chronicles. Medieval writers would mention that an army ravaged an area which included rape as part of the understood devastation. Laws against rape existed but were rarely enforced, especially if the perpetrator was a knight and the victim was a commoner. The social and legal system was designed to protect the interests of noble men, and women's safety was not a priority. Even in peacetime, women were vulnerable to violence from knights. Domestic violence was common and socially accepted within certain bounds. A man could beat his wife as long as he didn't kill her or cause permanent injury, and this was considered his right. Women had limited options for escape or redress. Divorce was nearly impossible. Separation required church annulment, which was expensive and difficult to obtain. Most women who were trapped in violent marriages simply had to endure it. The myth of chivalry, with knights as protectors of women, was just that, a myth, a literary invention that had little basis in reality. Real knights were as likely to harm women as protect them, and the power imbalance meant women had few defenses. The chivalric romances were propaganda, creating an idealized image of knighthood that bore little resemblance to actual knightly behavior. This extends to the broader pattern of violence that characterized knightly culture. Knights were trained from childhood to solve problems through violence. Disputes were settled by combat. Honor was defended through duels. Land was acquired through conquest. This meant that knights were effectively socialized to be violent, and that violence spilled over into all areas of their lives. They fought each other over trivial insults. They beat servants and peasants who displeased them. They participated enthusiastically in the brutal punishments that medieval justice prescribed for criminals. Medieval punishments were designed to be public spectacles of violence. Executions were entertainment, drawing large crowds. Methods included hanging, beheading, burning at the stake, drawing and quartering, and breaking on the wheel, all designed to maximize suffering and serve as deterrents. Knights not only attended these spectacles, but often participated in carrying out punishments as part of their administrative duties. The casual brutality of medieval justice would be shocking by modern standards, but it was normal and accepted in that period. This violence was also directed inward, at knights themselves through the system of honor and shame. A knight who was insulted had to respond or lose honor, which was social death. This meant that petty insults could escalate to lethal duels. A careless word could start a feud lasting generations. Knights lived under constant pressure to maintain their reputation, to respond to challenges, to never show weakness. This pressure drove irrational, self-destructive behavior that often ended in death or ruin. The concept of honor was a trap that killed countless knights. Honor demanded that you fight even when fighting was foolish. Honor demanded that you risk your life over trivial matters. Honor demanded that you maintain appearances even when you couldn't afford to. Knights bankrupted themselves, died in pointless duels, and ruined their families trying to satisfy impossible honor standards. The system was designed to maintain social hierarchy through violence and shame, and knights were both enforcers of the system and trapped by it. And let's be honest about the religious aspects of knighthood, because the relationship between knights and Christianity was complicated and often hypocritical. Knights were supposed to be defenders of the faith, Christian warriors upholding God's law. In reality, they routinely violated Christian principles. They killed, stole, raped, and committed various other sins while claiming religious justification. The Church tried to regulate knightly behavior through concepts like the peace of God and the truce of God, but enforcement was nearly impossible. The Crusades were perhaps the ultimate expression of this hypocrisy. Knights would take religious vows to fight for Christendom, then engage in shocking violence against civilians, including Christians, when it was convenient. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople saw Christian crusaders slaughtering Christian civilians and looting Christian churches, all while claiming to serve God. This kind of cognitive dissonance was apparently manageable for medieval minds in ways that seem baffling now. Knights would also use religious institutions for practical purposes that had nothing to do with piety. Younger sons, who couldn't inherit, would be pushed into the church, not from religious calling, but because it was one of the few career options available. Monasteries served as retirement homes for aging knights who could no longer fight. Churches and monasteries were places to stash inconvenient family members, like daughters who couldn't be married off or wives who were no longer needed. Even personal religious devotion, when it existed, was often transactional. Knights would endo churches or monasteries, not purely from faith, but to secure prayers for their souls and buy their way out of purgatory. They'd go on pilgrimage to holy sites, which often resembled military campaigns more than spiritual journeys. The line between genuine faith and practical use of religious institutions was blurry, and many knights probably existed somewhere in between, believing sincerely, but also using religion instrumentally. The church itself was complicit in this system. Bishops and abbots came from noble families, often were younger sons who'd been pushed into the church, and they brought the same violent, aristocratic culture with them. Warrior bishops who led armies into battle were not uncommon. Monasteries owned vast estates worked by peasants under the same feudal obligations as secular estates. The church as an institution was part of the feudal system, benefiting from and perpetuating the same power structures. So when we think about knights and their world, we need to strip away the romantic mythology and look at the reality. Knights were men born into a brutal, hierarchical society that trained them from childhood to be violent. They were given expensive military equipment and a social status that placed them above most people, and they used these advantages to maintain power and extract wealth from those beneath them. They lived under constant financial pressure, trying to maintain an expensive lifestyle on insufficient income, while simultaneously being expected to risk their lives in combat regularly. Their daily lives were uncomfortable by modern standards. They lived in cold, drafty buildings with poor sanitation. They ate salt, heavy preserved food, and drank alcohol because water was unsafe. They were in chronic pain from training injuries and accumulated damage. They watched children die from preventable diseases and lost friends to violence or infection. They participated in wars that were brutal and traumatic, engaging in violence that would be considered war crimes today. And they did all of this because the social system demanded it. Because refusing meant losing everything. The twilight of their military relevance came gradually, as technology and tactics evolved beyond the armored cavalry charge. By the 16th century, knights were increasingly ceremonial figures, their role on the battlefield taken over by professional infantry, artillery, and early firearms. They continued existing as a social class, as nobility, but their specific military function was obsolete. The entire expensive, elaborate system of knightly training and equipment became pointless, a relic of an earlier era. And what was their legacy? They left behind castles, many of which still stand. Romantic literature that bears little resemblance to reality, and a mythology that continues to shape how we think about the Middle Ages. We remember them as noble warriors when they were closer to armed thugs with good PR. We imagine them as heroes when they were products of a violent, unjust system that oppressed the vast majority of the population for the benefit of a small aristocratic elite. This isn't to say that every knight was a terrible person. Medieval people were as varied as modern people. Some knights genuinely tried to live up to chivalric ideals, treating others with honor and serving justice. Some were kind to their families and generous to the poor. But they were exceptions working within a system that encouraged and rewarded violence, greed, and exploitation. Even the best knights were constrained by their society's values and limitations. The Middle Ages were 1,000 years of history across an entire continent, so generalizations are necessarily imperfect. Knights in 11th century France had different experiences than knights in 15th century England. Regional differences were significant. But the core elements remained constant: a military aristocracy maintained through violence, expensive equipment that bankrupted families, brutal warfare that traumatized participants, and a social system that prioritized martial prowess and honor over human welfare. So when you see movies or play games that glorify knights, remember the reality. Remember the dysentery and the frostbite and the infected wounds. Remember the financial desperation and the political obligations you couldn't refuse. Remember the heat exhaustion in armor and the drowning in rivers because you were too heavy to swim. Remember the boredom of siege camps and the terror of charging into arrow fire. Remember the chronic pain and the early aging and the constant low-level violence of daily life. Being a knight wasn't glamorous. It was expensive, uncomfortable, dangerous, and often short. It was watching friends die badly and participating in atrocities. It was living under impossible honor codes and crushing financial pressure. It was training your entire life for a form of combat that was becoming obsolete. It was being part of a violent, unjust system and either not recognizing the injustice or not caring because you benefited from it. The romantic image of knighthood is powerful and persistent, but it's fundamentally false. It's a fantasy created by medieval romance writers and perpetuated by modern entertainment that needs heroes and villains, not complicated people living in a brutal time. The reality was far messier, uglier, and more interesting than the myth. Knights were human, flawed, trapped in their historical moment, doing the best they could within a system that was often terrible. Some succeeded, some failed, most muddled through, and eventually they all died, often painfully and before their time. And that's the unglamorous truth about being a knight in the Middle Ages. It mostly sucked, and then you died, possibly from dysentery, possibly from an infected blister, possibly from a lance through the eye socket at a tournament. But at least you looked impressive in your armor, right up until you overheated and passed out.